Now, you've been emailing and texting us your questions. Joining me in the studio to answer some of them is the employment barrister, Olivia Dobby from Cloisters Chambers. Olivia, the most obvious question which we got from a lot of people is, will I get the extra money? So who will get extra money?
Right, well, anyone whose pay packet comprises more than basic pay. So if you have a commission structure as part of your normal remuneration, or you work overtime regularly, those sorts of payments should now be counted when you're lying on the beach on holiday. Your pay should be the same and should include those. So it won't affect everyone.
It won't affect everyone. A related question, how will they work out how much extra I could get? How would they work out what people would get?
Well, there's a 12-week reference period over which to average out the pay. So if you're working different overtime from week to week, it would be averaged out over a 12-week period. There's a bit of uncertainty with that because that 12-week period comes from domestic law, and the domestic law is what's been challenged as being incompatible with European law. So we're left with a position where we think it might be a 12-week reference period and an average taken over that time, but in fact employers could argue for a longer period. So, for example, you might have seasonal workers that do a much greater degree of work in a particular time of the year.
Coming up to Christmas, for example,
exactly.
Some will do
you
that
do a lot
over
of
the summer
overtime
also.
In retail or something. Yeah. And those workers could very cleverly say, well, I'll take my annual leave immediately after, because if I look back over those 12 weeks, it's a very high average, but it's not reflective of my normal pay throughout the year. So there will be some businesses that want to argue for a longer reference period, and there has been suggested from European decisions that perhaps a 12-month reference period might be suitable.
I've been doing overtime for years. Will I be back paid for that? So can people ask, I've been with the company for 10 years, I want my back pay.
Well, this is the really big issue coming out of today's judgment, which is that yesterday employers were waiting with bated breath, thinking that they could be liable for pay going back 16 years, which is when the domestic legislation was brought into force with respect to holiday pay. What we now have coming out of the EAT judgment, which could still go on appeal, so it's not the end of the story, but what it says in effect is that for the vast majority of workers, you can only look back 3 months. So if you've taken holiday in the last 3 months and you were underpaid because it didn't take into account your commission or your overtime, then you can bring a claim for it. But looking further back than that, it's highly unlikely. A very small few will, but I won't go into the exceptions because they're very complicated.
Well, we did have somebody asking how would I claim for old underpayments, but you've kind of answered that in a way. But more interestingly, perhaps, what if my boss refuses to pay?
Well, if you've got a situation where the boss is refusing to pay for past liabilities, and in fact going forward into the future, it's best to raise a grievance with your employer in the first instance and try and resolve it internally. The problem is, for potential claimants, is that if they do that, they might be losing time, and so the clock starts to run, and they're looking back at their 3 months, but the 3 months period is moving. So for historic underpayments, they might want to put a claim in sooner rather than later. Going forward, if the employer continues to refuse to pay, raise a grievance, try to resolve it informally, and if you can't, then you might want to raise a claim for underpayment of wages.
And just a final thought, which came up from a number of people. If you run a small business, this could affect you quite badly, and we had a number of people who commented that way. So you haven't budgeted for this, this is going to be a bit of a blow, and some people think they could even go under.
Yes, I think various reports in the media have suggested that this is a very big issue that's going to destroy many businesses, and I think that's overstating the position. Only with respect to businesses that pay their workforce, payments other than basic pay are going to be affected. Where you have regular salaries and fixed hours, then it's going to be, normal, same as normal.
Which is most people.
Exactly. So same going forward as it was in the past. You continue to pay holiday pay on the basic salary. But where employers do have more creative elements, if I can put it that way, so overtime, commissions, some bonus payments, even shift premia, those sorts of payments, then it could affect them. And the extent to which it will affect them will depend very much on how they pay their workers. So, for example, if their workforce gets 60% of their pay packet as a commission payment, then of course it's going to affect the employer more to now have to pay that in holiday pay. So it's very case-specific to the way the workforce is paid.
And just the final point, which you also touched on, just to make sure I got you correctly, this could be overturned, couldn't it?
It could, yes. Leave to appeal to the Court of Appeal has been granted by the EAT, so that means that it's not necessarily the end of the story. It could go up to the Court of Appeal, then from there they could go to the Supreme Court if they wish, and eventually up to the European Court of Justice.
So don't book your holidays just yet, perhaps. Might be the moral of the story. Olivia, thanks very much.
Thank
Olivia
you.
Dobby there.